there's a specific, invisible boundary worth examining directly. Not the boundaries you set yourself, but a very different kind, one he carries internally, one he'll never explicitly name or acknowledge. That determines exactly how far he'll actually go before something shifts inside him that has nothing to do with genuine remorse and everything to do with self-preservation. Today, we're tracing what this red line actually consists of, why you can't see it coming until you've already crossed it, and why understanding it explains a specific, confusing pattern many people experience. Moments where behavior suddenly, inexplicably shifted seemingly without any clear provocation. Let's start with understanding why this red line exists at all, and why it remains genuinely invisible until the exact moment it's reached. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how heavily his psychological stability depends on maintaining a specific narrative about himself, not simply for others, but for his own internal use, protecting his own fragile self-concept from full confrontation with his actual behavior. Here's what this red line actually represents: the specific threshold where his own behavior threatens to become undeniable even to himself, where continuing further would require acknowledging something his defensive architecture cannot survive acknowledging. Here's why you can't see this line coming, and why it's genuinely different from anything you might reasonably anticipate. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how his behavior often escalates gradually, incrementally, in ways that never provide a clear, identifiable moment where genuine confrontation would seem warranted. This red line doesn't operate according to any logic you could reasonably predict, because it's not actually about the severity of harm caused to you. It's about something entirely internal to him, the specific point where his own self-image can no longer accommodate what he's doing, regardless of how that behavior actually objectively affects you. Here's the first thing worth understanding about how this line typically manifests: sudden, seemingly disproportionate retreats. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the specific pattern of sudden coldness following genuine intimacy. Sometimes this red line gets crossed not through escalating cruelty, but through the opposite, a moment of genuine closeness that suddenly, inexplicably triggers withdrawal, precisely because genuine closeness threatens his self-image in ways cruelty, paradoxically, sometimes doesn't. So this explains a specific, confusing pattern many people experience: relationships that seem to be genuinely improving, only to encounter sudden, seemingly baseless retreat right when things felt closest to working. Here's the second thing worth understanding: this line often gets crossed specifically when he witnesses genuine evidence of his own impact on you. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the brief window of genuine private guilt that exists before defensive processing typically neutralizes it. Sometimes his red line gets triggered not by his own behavior's objective severity, but by direct, undeniable confrontation with its actual effect. Witnessing genuine tears, witnessing genuine devastation that becomes impossible to reframe or minimize in the moment it's occurring. This crossing often produces not increased care, but increased distance, precisely because this undeniable evidence threatens his self-concept more severely than behavior he can successfully rationalize away. Here's the third thing worth understanding: this line sometimes gets crossed through witnesses, specifically people whose opinion genuinely matters to his own self-image. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how his stability depends on managing perception across every social context. Behavior that continues indefinitely in private sometimes suddenly, dramatically shifts once a specific witness, a parent, a respected colleague, someone whose judgment genuinely matters to his own self-concept, becomes aware of it. It's not because the behavior's harm to you has changed, but because his own tolerance for how this behavior reflects on his self-image has been genuinely, specifically threatened. So let's trace what actually happens once this invisible red line gets crossed, because understanding the specific, predictable aftermath reveals something important about why this crossing so rarely produces the accountability or the lasting change you might reasonably hope for. Here's the first thing worth understanding: crossing this line typically produces sudden behavior modification, but this modification almost never reflects genuine, comprehensive change. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the technique that produces apology-shaped words without producing comprehensive accountability. Once his own internal red line gets crossed, expect exactly this kind of narrow, strategic adjustment, behavior that specifically addresses whatever crossed the line, while leaving the broader, underlying pattern entirely intact. If public embarrassment triggered the crossing, expect improved behavior specifically in contexts where witnesses might observe it, while private behavior remains largely unchanged. If your visible devastation triggered the crossing, expect temporary softening specifically around whatever produced that devastation, while other, related patterns continue exactly as before. Here's the second thing worth understanding: this crossing often produces genuine, if temporary, anxiety in him. Connecting to something we've traced extensively throughout our conversation about what narcissists do when they know they're guilty. The specific window of genuine private discomfort we examined in detail. The preemptive counter-accusation, the uncharacteristic generosity. The anxious information gathering often intensifies considerably once this internal red line has genuinely been crossed, precisely because the threat to his self-concept feels considerably more acute than during ordinary, more gradual patterns of harm. This intensity, however, tends to fade at exactly the rate this earlier conversation traced, typically resolving back into the same defensive architecture within days, rather than producing anything resembling lasting, integrated change. Here's the third thing worth understanding: this crossing sometimes produces something worth naming directly. A specific kind of resentment directed at whatever or whoever revealed the crossing, rather than genuine accountability for the behavior itself. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic psychology tends to redirect discomfort outward, rather than integrating it inward. If a witness's awareness triggered the crossing, expect subtle or sometimes overt resentment toward that witness, rather than genuine reflection on the behavior that made their awareness so uncomfortable in the first place. If your own visible devastation triggered the crossing, watch for a specific, painful pattern: subtle blame directed at you for having reacted so visibly, for having made a scene, or overreacted, rather than genuine acknowledgement that your reaction was a reasonable response to genuinely harmful behavior. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding. It's one that addresses something particularly important for anyone who's experienced this specific crossing and found themselves briefly hopeful about what it might mean. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the crucial distinction between isolated incident and demonstrated pattern. The temporary behavior modification that follows crossing this internal red line, however genuine it might feel in the moment, typically reflects reaction to a specific, threatening circumstance rather than the sustained, comprehensive transformation that would actually indicate something structurally different has developed. This distinction matters enormously because it's precisely this temporary, crisis-driven modification that so often gets mistaken for genuine lasting change, producing exactly the renewed hope this entire series has cautioned against extensively throughout dozens of previous conversations. Here's the fifth thing worth understanding. It's one that offers something genuinely important about how to interpret whether this specific crossing represents anything meaningful for your own decision-making moving forward. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between narrow, situational awareness and genuine, integrated self-understanding. If you're evaluating whether this crossing represents something worth factoring into your own decisions about the relationship's continuations, the relevant question isn't whether temporary modification followed the crossing. It's whether this modification extends into other, related patterns beyond specifically whatever triggered the crossing, and whether it sustains itself considerably beyond the immediate period of heightened anxiety this crossing typically temporarily produces. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this invisible red line, despite its apparent significance in the moment it's crossed, ultimately matters considerably less for your own healing than understanding the broader, sustained pattern this entire series has traced extensively across dozens of previous conversations. The line's crossing reveals genuine information about the specific limits of his own self-tolerance, but it reveals considerably less about his genuine capacity for the kind of sustained, comprehensive change that would actually make continued relationships safe or wise. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it, rather than leaving this conversation as simply an analysis of his internal mechanism, without addressing what genuinely matters most: how to use this understanding to protect your own decision-making, and why this invisible red line, however revealing, was never actually the marker your own healing needed to depend on. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something worth naming directly, connecting to a specific trap this understanding could otherwise create. If you find yourself trying to predict, identify, or strategically trigger this internal red line, believing that if you could just find the specific thing that would cross it, you might finally produce the accountability or the change you've been hoping for. You've transformed genuinely useful psychological understanding into exactly the kind of continued, exhausting engagement this entire series has repeatedly cautioned against. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how this crossing, even when genuinely achieved, produces only narrow, Temporary modification rather than comprehensive, lasting change. Deliberately searching for this line to trigger it isn't a viable strategy for producing genuine transformation, regardless of how tempting this approach might seem once you understand the mechanism. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that offers a considerably more useful application of everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. Understanding this invisible red line matters primarily for retrospective clarity, helping you make sense of confusing patterns you may have already experienced, sudden shifts in behavior that seem to arrive without warning or explanation. If you've witnessed this specific crossing occur in your own relationship history, understanding the mechanism behind it helps you accurately interpret what actually happened, protecting you from mistaking temporary, crisis-driven modification for genuine, sustained transformation. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms, this red line, however genuinely revealing about the limits of his own self-tolerance, was never actually about you, and it was never actually the marker that should determine your own decisions about safety, about boundaries, or about the relationship's continuation. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how genuine decision-making should be based on sustained, demonstrated pattern rather than isolated, crisis-driven responses to specific triggering circumstances. Whether this line gets crossed or remains permanently uncrossed throughout an entire relationship's duration, your own right to protect yourself, your own right to establish boundaries, your own right to leave entirely, was never actually contingent on him reaching whatever specific threshold his own psychology happens to maintain. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about what actually deserves your attention instead of this invisible, unpredictable line. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the more reliable, more accurate signals worth trusting, the accumulated pattern over time, the consistent behavior across multiple contexts, your own accurate perception developed through sustained observation rather than dependent on waiting for some specific, dramatic crossing to finally provide clarity. This red line, however genuinely real and however genuinely revealing about his own internal architecture, represents just one small piece of a considerably larger picture, one that never actually required this specific crossing in order to already completely justify whatever protective action you needed to take. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. You were never actually required to wait for this invisible red line to reveal itself before trusting your own accumulated evidence, your own accumulated pattern recognition, your own genuine, accurate understanding of what this relationship actually was and what it actually required from you to survive it. This line exists, genuinely and predictably, according to the specific mechanism we've traced throughout today's conversation, but its existence was never actually the thing standing between you and whatever clarity or whatever protective action you genuinely needed all along. You don't need to see this invisible line coming in order to trust what you've already accurately observed throughout the relationship's entire duration. You don't need to witness this specific crossing in order to validate decisions you've already made or decisions you're currently, honestly working toward. This red line belongs entirely to his own internal architecture, revealing genuine information about him, but requiring nothing from you in order for your own healing, your own protections, and your own genuine clarity to remain exactly as valid and exactly as complete as they've always genuinely been, entirely independent of whether this specific, invisible threshold was ever crossed at all throughout the entire time you knew him. There's one more dimension worth adding here, because it addresses something practical worth carrying forward. What if you're currently still in a relationship where you've witnessed this specific line get crossed multiple times, each time followed by exactly the temporary, narrow modification we've traced throughout this conversation, and you find yourself genuinely uncertain whether the repetition itself might eventually accumulate into something more lasting? This deserves direct, honest examination, because this specific hope that enough repeated crossings might eventually produce genuine, sustained change represents one of the more common, more understandable traps this particular pattern creates. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how repeated cycles, rather than accumulating toward genuine transformation, tend instead to accumulate toward increasing skill at exactly the temporary, narrow modification we've traced throughout today's conversation. Each time this red line gets crossed and produces its predictable, temporary response, his psychology doesn't accumulate wisdom from the experience in the way genuine growth would require. It accumulates instead, increasing practice at successfully navigating the discomfort of crossing without ever needing to address the underlying pattern that produces this crossing repeatedly. This means repetition. Rather than eventually producing the breakthrough you might be hoping for, more often produces the opposite. A narcissist produces its predictable, temporary response. His psychology doesn't accumulate wisdom from the experience in the way genuine growth would require. It accumulates, instead, increasing practice at successfully navigating the discomfort of crossing without ever needing to address the underlying pattern that produces this crossing repeatedly. This means repetition. Rather than eventually producing the breakthrough you might be hoping for, more often produces the opposite. A narcissist who becomes increasingly skilled at performing exactly enough temporary modification to diffuse the immediate crisis, while the underlying pattern remains fully, permanently intact underneath. Here's what this means practically, and it's worth stating directly rather than softening it. If you've witnessed this line crossed multiple times, each time followed by the same familiar sequence: genuine, temporary anxiety, narrow behavioral adjustment, gradual return to baseline, the accumulated evidence you're actually looking at isn't evidence that change is building towards something bigger. It's evidence of a stable, repeating cycle, one that will likely continue producing exactly this same pattern indefinitely, for as long as you remain present to trigger, and then absorb each successive crossing. Here's something worth understanding about why this specific realization matters so much more than continuing to search for the moment when repetition finally, somehow, produces something different. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the exhausted patience that eventually has to transform into genuine release. If you recognize this repeating cycle clearly in your own relationship history, the question worth asking isn't, how many more times might this need to happen before something changes? It's, how much longer am I willing to remain present for a cycle that has already reliably demonstrated its own predictable, limited outcome repeatedly, without ever once producing the sustained change I've been hoping to eventually witness? Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. It's one that returns us to the central truth underlying everything this series has established across dozens of previous discussions. This invisible red line, and every cycle of crossing and temporary modification that follows it, was never actually a test you needed to pass, never actually a puzzle requiring your continued patience to solve, so never actually evidence that persistence would eventually be rewarded if you simply witnessed enough repetitions. It's simply the predictable, structural output of a psychological architecture this entire series has traced extensively, one that produces this same pattern with remarkable consistency, regardless of how many times it repeats or how long you remain present to witness it. You don't need to see this line coming. You don't need to wait for its next crossing, hoping this time might finally be different. You don't need to keep gathering evidence from a cycle that has already completely revealed everything it's ever going to reveal about its own predictable limitations. Whatever clarity you've already gathered, whatever pattern you've already accurately witnessed, remains sufficient, complete, and entirely valid, requiring no further crossings, no further waiting, and no further patience in order to justify whatever protective decision genuinely serves your own life moving forward. The line exists. It will likely keep existing, exactly as we've traced throughout this entire conversation, for as long as he remains exactly who this entire series has traced him to be. But your own life, your own healing, and your own genuine freedom to move forward were never actually required to wait for this line's next crossing in order to become entirely, completely, permanently yours.